Peter Beinart is an author. He is a professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York's Journalism School. He also writes for Jewish Currents. He's a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times, and among other things, also a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. And his regularly published writings can be found on Substack at Beinart Notebook. Uh, so first of all, Peter, welcome to the program.
Thanks.
Secondly, I wanted to talk to you about a book. You have been one of the, I would say, leading voices, certainly from within the Jewish community, but nationally, overall, uh, opposing the killings in Gaza without condoning October 7th or any such thing, speaking out within the community as well as outside it on this issue. Your new book, which I will hold up now, you can see I've been reading it because it has dog tags in it, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. I'll start with this. Uh, First of all, the title is already, of interest to me, but a reckoning. Reckoning must have been a carefully chosen word, I would think. If I'm right about that, why that specific word?
Well, because I think that I think American Jews around the world have to um, reckon with the significance of what's happened, which is that Israel has now destroyed an entire society. The 2 million people, the vast majority of people have been forced from their homes, most of the buildings destroyed, most of the hospitals, most of the schools and universities, most of the agriculture, a place that is now catastrophically unlivable for people. And now we have the United States president literally talking about those people being forcibly expelled from the territory. And this was done with American weapons, but it was done in the name of the Jewish people. Israel claims to speak for Jews as a people, and it was done with the complicity, if not active support, of much of the organized American Jewish community. So when you have been complicit, when the institutions have been complicit in one of, I think, what will certainly go down as one of the greatest crimes of the 21st century, I think one has to ask what's gone wrong.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think, as you point out, this is a course of events that began more than 100 years ago, well more than 100 years ago. But one of the things that has struck me in following this, as someone who was raised Jewish myself, I mean, I still remember going to the movie theater and seeing the movie Exodus with my parents, with its theme song, this land is mine. God gave this land to me, right? I mean, this was what so many of us were steeped in, and one of the things, and I've orbited in and out over the years of my own work and criticizing, violent incidents of one side or of one kind or another from one side or another. But what strikes me about this is that I think it's not just a reckoning in a sense for me, in a moral sense, about what Israel's doing and how to the Gazans and the people on the West Bank and how the United States is aiding and abetting that. I think that is a moral reckoning. But I think for a lot of people, including people who didn't think they would be challenged by this, like me, it's forcing us to reckon with some deeply held assumptions and beliefs that were imbued in us in childhood, and that we now have to directly confront or face cognitive dissonance. So you've had a journey. It seems that you've had a journey in that respect. I think you were, forgive me if I'm wrong, and please correct me, but I think you were a progressive, basically defender of Israel, who came to see that the enterprise of Israel as designed is fundamentally unjust. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think so. I grew up in a family, like many other American Jews, that was very connected to Israel. It was very important to my grandmother in particular, but to a lot of people in our family, as a sense of kind of security that there was a Jewish state in a post-Holocaust world. And I spent time in Israel as a kid. My father worked there. I saw how happy my father was when he was there, and my grandfather. And I was also felt very connected to the place and still do as a kind of a Jewish civilization, which is a remarkable thing to be part of if you're used to being a very small minority. It was only really in my 30s that I first spent time with Palestinians in the West Bank and could begin to imagine what Israel meant for them. And it forced me to think about the Palestinian experience in a way that I hadn't before, and to begin to kind of ponder the question of whether it really was ethical to support a state that gave Jews legal supremacy over Palestinians, especially since I oppose that principle of ethno-nationalist legal supremacy in the United States and in other places. On what basis was I going to make an exception for Israel? So yes, that was the journey that took place over a course of decades.
And as I think about that, I think about the fact that uh, we were always, I was certainly raised to believe that this was a fundamental requirement for the safety of the Jewish people
Mm.
everywhere. And yet, as you just mentioned, that there is no sense, if anything, and in your writing it has certainly alluded to this, I don't think Jews worldwide feel safe right now. So, isn't there an inherent conflict in that? Isn't there? What I'm trying to get at is, uh, isn't there a sort of, shouldn't we all be experiencing a cognitive dissonance about this? That it's supposed to be something that makes us safer, but there's endless war and it's dividing the Jewish community. Isn't that kind of a wake-up call in a way, or am I reading too much into this?
Well, I think one of the ironies is that there is this discourse that says that to be safe, Jews must rule in Israel-Palestine. But Israel-Palestine, where Jews rule, is actually the least safe place of any large Jewish community in the world. Jews are safer in the diaspora communities, even though we're small minorities, because those states have some commitment to equality under the law. And so and the reason for that, I think, is that in systems of legal supremacy, you inflict a lot of violence on people who are made legal inferiors, whether it's Palestinians or Black South Africans or Black Americans during Jim Crow or Catholics in Northern Ireland. And so that system of structural violence, which comes with oppression, produces an armed resistance that actually endangers everybody. Whereas in political systems where, even if they're flawed, as goodness knows America's is and becoming more so, where people have a voice in government through the vote, then actually I think you have nonviolent mechanisms to try to get the government to meet your needs. And so the likelihood of violence is lower. And so that to me is actually, there's this irony that most American Jews are staking our own safety on the principle of equality under the law, but we can't imagine often that that might be the right principle for Israeli Jews as well. But I argue that it is.
And it strikes me also that the argument, as you address very well, that the argument is often framed in terms of Israel's right to exist. Do you question? And you wrote about that I thought, very clearly. And basically, if you don't mind recapping that a little bit for the folks
Sure.
listening, I think it's an important point.
Sure. My argument is that states don't have unconditional value. States are, and this is a position I think you see within Jewish tradition, that states are instruments for the protection and flourishing of human life, for the life of the people who live within those states. That the entity that has unconditional value is the human being. And then one judges a state based on how well it's treating the human beings under its control. So if a state radically fails to protect the life of the human beings under its control. Indeed, if it threatens the life of the human beings under its control, then we should rethink the nature of that state. So the state does not have a right to exist in its current form. And I think if you think about the way Americans talk about a lot of other countries, this is actually kind of natural for us, right? Many American politicians might say, we would like there to be a different kind of state in China or Cuba or Iran or Russia, right? One that does a better job of protecting the rights and liberties of the people under its control. So many Americans would like there might be a country in China, but they would like it not to be the People's Republic of China with its Communist Party rule, right? And so it seems to me therefore, given that Israel has been called an apartheid state even by its own human rights organizations, right? Quite natural to think, could we reimagine this state so it provided greater equality and freedom so that the people under its control, all of whom, Jewish and Palestinian, might be able to flourish and be safer.
And in that sense, that speaks to an argument usually implicit, but sometimes made explicit regarding Israel, which is the idea that changing Israel's religious and ethnic foundation is indistinguishable from a mass extermination of the Jews who live there. I
Right.
think those two are, and perhaps at times rhetoric on the Palestinian side has contributed to that, but we're talking about, maybe drive them into the sea or whatever has been said one
Right.
too many times. But the fact is, in most cases, I mean, even the Hamas has started in 2017 said, Jews are welcome to live in the new Palestine, whether they mean it or not. I leave to others. But we fail to distinguish, I think, in our own internal debates here in the United States, and I wonder if you agree and what you think about this, between the right of Israelis to exist versus the right
Yes.
of Israel to exist in its present form.
Yes, absolutely. And the point I make in the book is that this notion that equality under the law means death or expulsion or at least subjugation is not unique to Israeli Jews, or it's actually kind of the norm for people who are become accustomed to legal supremacy. So if you're talking about, I quote the Protestant leader Ian Paisley on the eve of the Good Friday Agreement, which gave Catholics political equality, and he called it a prelude to genocide. If you look at American writing during slavery and American white writing during slavery and segregation, it's commonplace for people to basically say, I'm basically something along the lines of, if blacks are not slaves, we whites will be slaves. And for white South Africans, it was just considered obvious that given that a black government would place them in mortal danger. So part of the what I try to do in the book is ask Jews to think about why those groups of people were wrong, as a way of thinking about the possibility that we may be wrong. And my basic argument is that actually, when people gain the right to be represented in government, their likelihood of using armed resistance and violence goes down. And in fact, I think Israeli Jews in some ways are actually in a stronger position. If you think white South Africans were only 10% of the population, for instance, right?
Right.
Israeli Jews are 50% of the population between the Mediterranean and the Jordan. And the astonishing thing, actually, in a way, if you look at post-apartheid South Africa or post-segregation America or post Good Friday Accords Northern Ireland, is not only that the groups that had historical privilege have not been subjugated or killed, but actually that they have maintained a lot of their privilege, right?
Right.
Because these privileges actually endure even under conditions of legal equality, right? Which is in of itself a kind of a problem and a challenge. But I think it just speaks to how I think radically that the discourse that kind of we have about this is actually a product of a certain kind of fear and also a kind of a kind of assumption of supremacy as necessary for life, when in fact I think it's actually dangerous for Israeli Jewish life.
And there's an emotional element to that kind of thinking that you describe, uh, that kind, the fear of genocide and that kind of thing. There's especially that's specific to Jews, which is in what is still living memory, to however few, but within living memory, there was in fact a horrific genocide against the
Right,
Jewish people, and the Jewish
right,
people have been driven from country to country, not by Palestinians, but all across
right,
Western Europe.
right,
My own grandparents were refugees from the pogroms and so on. This is not, and so I was especially touched also by a couple of the anecdotal things you say in the book. And oh boy, I'm going to have to wear my glasses and prove that I really do need glasses. But the idea of going to, for example, I think it was when you went away to college or something, that uh, uh, that your mother or grandmother looked for Jewish names on the
Mm,
lists of people who were
My
there?
mother, yeah,
Yeah, but your
yeah,
mother got Cohen, a Shapiro. We used to tease my father when we were kids because it was very important to him to point out the famous people who were actually Jewish, right?
right,
Michael
right,
Douglas, Jewish.
right,
Tony Curtis, Jewish. We used to tease him, say Pope Paul, Jewish.
right,
Nobody knows, but he's
right, right,
so.
right, right. Yeah, I think there is a kind of metaphor in Jewish tradition of Jews as a kind of an imagined family, even
Mhm.
even in Jewish texts. And the Torah is the really most the book of Genesis is mostly the story of a family, and then in the book of Exodus, that family becomes a kind of a people or a nation. And so I think this idea runs through, and then the experience of trauma perhaps kind of reinforces that this sense of obligation or solidarity. There's the often quote line from the Talmud, Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh B'Zeh, all Jews are responsible for one another. And so I was trying to suggest that this is a very understandable and I think even laudable kind of instinct towards obligation towards one another, one that I feel myself. And yet I think it can be used as a way of of kind of it can be weaponized in such a way that tells Jews that solidarity means supporting whatever a Jewish state does, no matter what it does to Palestinians. And that's where it becomes dangerous.
And what has struck me about that, just in my self-education in the last year and a half, or re-education in some cases, is how recent an idea in Jewish history Zionism is, and the need for a Jewish state. I mean, for how many centuries have
Right,
Jews said next year in Jerusalem,
right,
but now you can buy a ticket. And so to me, that was a spiritual affirmation. I remember in Hebrew school asking the rabbi when I was 10, and I'm not particularly, that much smarter than anybody else, but asking, well, it says here that the Messiah comes, and the
right,
Messiah isn't here, but the
right,
Messiah comes, and then we go back. So
right,
how come we're going back? Isn't this against
right.
Scripture? And he didn't really have a good answer, but that to me it's been a rewriting of the Jewish DNA code a little bit for me in the last 150 years.
Yes, that's right. And that's why Zionism was generally rejected by Jewish, religious leaders in its early decades. And really, there was a lot of opposition up until the creation of this, really until the 1940s, right? Because the traditional interpretation of the Talmud was that through a section called the Three Oaths was that basically Jews could not return to rebuild the temple to recreate sovereignty until messianic times. That Jews would pray for this, but that would be in God's hands, right? And this was a way for Jews of a kind of maintaining a connection and a longing, right? But also acclimating to the lands in which they were living. And then Zionism is a movement led by secular Jews, which
Right.
revolts against this. Because it's really it's influenced by the currents that exist in late 19th and early 20th century Central and Eastern Europe, where great multinational empires are breaking apart. You have nationalist movements all over Europe. And Jews are asking, well, where do we fit into these nationalist movements since we're often not accepted as Ukrainians or Poles or Hungarians or Lithuanians? What would be our nationalist movement, right? And so then Zionism essentially piggybacks on this traditional Jewish religious longing for the land of Israel and turns it into a political nationalist movement, also a movement that has as Edward Said pointed out, imperialist features as well, because it's a European movement that imagines bringing kind of progress and modernity and also dispossession to what is considered a backward part of the world.
Right. And so a land without a people,
Right.
a
Or
people
people
without a
without a
land for
land. Right.
land. Yeah, you know what I'm saying. The
Yes.
idea that there were no people there was to speak of was it drummed
Right.
into us.
Right. Or I think one way of thinking about this phrase, a land without a people, is not necessarily to say that they didn't realize there were people there, right? But that those Arabs, as we would describe them, we would call them Palestinians, were not a people in the sense that they had national worth that had to be reckoned with, right? They were a group of individuals who essentially whose value was lesser than the value of Jews who wanted to move and take political control over this land, which was not atypical for Europeans in that time as they were thinking about taking political dominion over large swaths of what we would now consider the developing world.
And part of this, for me, the nationalist conversation is that, and I've reported on genetics and DNA research and all that, as well as looking into this in the context of the Middle East, is that nationality, if you get down to the biochemical level or biophysical level, it's amorphous.
Mhm.
So, are we, as descendants of European Jews, can we trace ancestry back to the Middle East? Yes,
Mhm.
absolutely. Maybe as much as 20%,
Mhm.
30% could be, but the only people that consistently in DNA studies are more clearly resident in this land, descendants from the Canaanites who preceded the Jews, are Lebanese and
Mhm.
Palestinians. So that part of the argument requires us to cling to what I think is an outdated concept of nationalism, right? I mean, and yet we have done so as a community by and large, and I'm not sure how one goes about. It's one conversation. I mean, what community I'm in right now, frankly, is a whole other story. That's complicated. But uh, how does one talk with one's fellow Jews about this without, in effect, being excommunicated or ostracized? I'm sure this must have been painful for you.
Yeah, these conversations, as you know, are very emotional and can be bitter. I don't think one really needs essentially to engage the question of to what degree Jews today are are the kind of biological ancestors of of people who we might read about in the Hebrew Bible or even more recently of of the people who were in the land in what we call the land of Israel at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. To me, there is what we can affirm is that there is that Jewish tradition and Jewish texts created a discourse, a religious discourse, in which Jews felt, wherever they were, most Jews felt a very, very deep connection to this place, right? And I
Mhm.
think we can also affirm that Jews should have the right to live in this place. My central point would be that they have the right to live there equally, not the right, not to have legal supremacy. And so if you and I think that if you um, uh, I think if one takes that as a kind of political as a kind of moral framework, then I think one can have a dialogue with Palestinians about legal equality that doesn't require people to necessarily agree on the ancient origins of the Jewish people,
Mhm.
because people can agree on a basic political understanding that respects the equal humanity of both groups.
And you point out in terms of that recognizing our mutual humanity. You point out that makes us that makes the Jewish people safer too. You quote a 2010 study of 146 instances of ethnic conflict since World War II, and found that ethnic groups excluded from state power were times more likely to take up arms. This is the most sensitive subject of all, in my experience, Peter, because uh, in fact, international law seems to suggest that the Palestinians have a right to armed resistance. They don't have a right to war crimes, which it seems like there were, but that's a tough one, even for me to get right in my head.
Sure, it is sensitive, and I think it's important to have this conversation without dehumanizing Israelis or suggesting that Israeli
Mhm.
life is not precious. I think that the groups that are under occupation have the right to armed resistance against military forces, right? And we see that the United States is arming Ukrainians to do just that against the Russians, right? The African National Congress in South Africa was an armed resistance group. Nelson Mandela did not believe in nonviolence. But I think the distinction between armed resistance against military targets and armed resistance against civilians is a very important distinction, which unfortunately Hamas did not respect, kind of flagrantly violated on October 7th. So I think that to me is the critical point. But yes, I mean, if I think nonviolence is preferable, but I also think that we are actually accustomed when in American discourse, when we recognize that there is an occupation or an invasion that we recognize as wrong, we take it as a matter of course that people have the right to resist with arms, again, as long as they do so without committing war crimes against civilians. And oftentimes, in fact, we support them to do that, right? If China were to invade Taiwan, the United States is already sending huge amounts of weaponry to Taiwan to defend itself. And nobody and no one in Congress would suggest that the Taiwanese had to do that in a purely nonviolent way.
Yes, and the fact is that the Palestinians, as you well know, have tried nonviolence
Right,
and been shot for it.
right,
So it's kind of, I used to make that argument myself for decades that
right.
I wish the Palestinians would understand the power of nonviolence. Well, they do, and I didn't understand the
Right. And if you want to encourage Palestinians to use nonviolence, then you have to support Palestinian nonviolence. This seems to me the kind of the one of the fundamental problems, right? Which is that if people are more likely to use nonviolent tactics if those work, right? But what the United States and Israel have done is they've essentially defeated a whole series of Palestinian nonviolent efforts, whether it's boycotts and efforts at divestment and sanctions and nonviolent marches like the Great March of Return and efforts at going to international institutions. So on the one hand, you condemn Palestinians for not using nonviolence enough. And on the other hand, basically, when they use nonviolence, you oppose it, right? Help to make it ineffective, which actually strengthens Hamas and those folks who want to use violent resistance, including against civilians.
exactly. And another aspect of it, though, when having these conversations is you and I can talk to like-minded people as much as we want, and we all kind of grasp this stuff. But you talk about losing friendships. I've lost friendships, but I've also been, I have to tell you, deeply heartbroken
Mm,
over what seems to me to be both Jewish and non-Jewish, but people I've known for many years to be good and decent and
mm.
wanting the best for all human beings. Uh, Seemingly almost is like color blindness is the way it feels to me, that they just can't see the injustice of the situation in this one single instance as opposed to every other. So not it's painful and to a
Right.
certain extent baffling. And I'm how do you deal with that?
Yeah. I mean, the book is really an effort to interrogate the stories that I think people tell that have the effect of allowing them to kind of blind themselves to these things, right? And these are the stories of kind of permanent Jewish victimhood that um, uh, kind of cast Palestinians as the kind of ancestors of the Nazis or of Amalek or Haman from the Bible or the kind of the people who committed pogroms in the Russian Empire. And and I think then by doing that, essentially, it kind of justifies what Israel does, right? Because if you are in this situation where you are a group of people facing extermination, you kind of fight back in however what in to survive in whatever form you can. And the point I try to argue in the book is that this effort to kind of put Israel Palestine into this framework of Jewish permanent righteous victimhood fundamentally misunderstands the reality of a place where it's actually Palestinians who lack basic freedoms and Jews who have legal supremacy. And you have to recognize that in order to understand the violence that exists.
I think that's exactly right. And I guess in closing, I mean, so much more I wish we could talk about, Peter, but I guess in closing, I would ask you, and I, as myself, just to put my cards on the how optimistic slash pessimistic you are. And I'll just briefly answer by saying I'm pessimistic in the short term, optimistic in the long term. I feel like the arc of history has shifted in the last 2 years, but that's me. Are you optimistic, pessimistic, neither?
Um, I'm pessimistic. I think that right now there's nothing strong enough to not a counterforce strong enough to prevent Israel from proceeding along a path that seems to me to kind of, if allowed to continue for decades more, kind of it may have the effect of doing to Palestinians what was done to Native Americans in the United States in the 19th century, which is not that every last Palestinian is going to die, but that Palestinians will essentially be destroyed as a people to the extent that they can't really function politically anymore and resist. And I worry that, given the fact that international norms of state behavior are weakening rather than strengthening, that actually, and that you have now the United States, actively supporting, emphatically kind of supporting this effort. I worry that this effort may be able to continue, and what was done in the 19th century may be possible to be done in the 21st century. But I hope I'm wrong, and I think if I am proven wrong, I suspect it will be because there is a movement that emerges across the world and is able to change politics in the United States and Europe such that Israel doesn't have impunity anymore. And it forces Israel into rethinking its behavior and creates a different political environment that allows or even forces Israel to basically start to take account of Palestinians' need for basic rights. So I think that would be my hope.
We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.